I remember the day everything changed as if it were yesterday. My heart was pounding as I sat across from my husband Mark, in our cozy dining room in a quiet suburb of Oakville. I had spent countless late nights crafting a handmade memory book for him, pouring every ounce of my love into each page. It was filled with snapshots of our life together, trips to the coast, quiet evenings by the fireplace, and silly moments that made us laugh. I thought it would be the perfect gift to show him how much he meant to me. But as I slid it across the table with a shy smile, his reaction shattered me. Mark barely glanced at the book before pushing it aside with a scoff. "What is this supposed to be, Clara?" he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "A bunch of old photos and sappy notes? This is the best you could do? I was expecting something useful, not this pointless junk." His words cut deep, like a knife twisting in my chest. I clenched my hands under the table, trying to keep my composure. "I thought you'd like something personal," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "These are our memories, everything we've shared." He rolled his eyes, leaning back in his chair with an exasperated sigh. "Memories? I'm tired of all this emotional nonsense, Clara. You're so caught up in feelings that you can't even see what I need. It's embarrassing, honestly." I swallowed hard, fighting back the tears threatening to spill over. But before I could respond, he stood up, running a hand through his hair with a frustrated groan. "You know what? I'm done with this. I'm done with you. You're not adding anything to my life, just dragging me down with this pathetic attempt at being sweet." My stomach churned as I processed his words. "What are you saying, Mark?" I asked, my voice trembling, despite my efforts to stay strong. He crossed his arms, a cold smirk playing on his lips. "I'm leaving you, Clara. I found someone else. Her name's Sophie. She's young, full of life, and knows how to have a good time, unlike you." His confession hit me like a tidal wave, knocking the air out of my lungs. But I refused to let him see me crumble. "And you think this is how you tell me? After I've poured my heart into this gift?" I asked, my tone steady despite the storm inside me. He let out a harsh, dismissive laugh. "Your heart? That's exactly the problem. You're all emotion and no substance. I deserve better." I sat there, stunned, his cruel words echoing in my mind. But then something unexpected happened. I started to laugh. It wasn't forced or bitter, it was real, bubbling up from somewhere deep inside me. The sound sliced through the heavy silence in the room. "What's so funny?" Mark snapped, his eyes narrowing as he stared at me. I stood up, still chuckling, and reached for the memory book. "You have no idea what you're throwing away," I said, flipping to the very last page. He frowned, suspicion creeping into his expression. "What are you talking about?" I pulled out a folded piece of paper tucked into the back of the book and held it up for him to see. "This," I said, "is the deed to a lakeside cabin I bought for us. I was going to surprise you with it tonight, but I guess that plan's out the window now." His jaw dropped, and for the first time that evening he was completely speechless. You bought a cabin?" he stammered, his smug demeanor crumbling. I smiled, tucking the deed safely into my bag. "Looks like Sophie won't be enjoying that, will she?" His face twisted into a mix of shock and panic. "Since when do you make decisions like that?" he muttered, clearly thrown off balance. I tilted my head, my smile unwavering. "Since I realized I can't rely on you for anything that truly matters, Mark. While you were busy chasing excitement with someone half your age, I was planning a future for us. My mistake for thinking we wanted the same thing." He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. His eyes darted to the book on the table as if he could somehow reclaim what he'd just tossed aside. "You're overreacting," he finally said, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "This doesn't change anything. Sophie and you," I interrupted, shaking my head. "I don't care, Mark. Take her. Take your so-called exciting life and get out of mine. You've made it crystal clear where I stand with you." With that, I turned and walked toward the bedroom we'd shared for years. I could hear him muttering excuses behind me, pacing as if he could figure out a way to undo the mess he'd made. But I was done listening. I packed a small overnight bag, my hands moving on autopilot as I glanced at the framed photos on the dresser. Our wedding day, vacations by the sea, moments that once felt so precious. Now they seemed like artifacts from a life I'd outgrown, a life I'd clung to for far too long. When I returned to the living room, Mark was standing by the door, arms crossed, trying to look composed. "You're really just walking out?" he asked, his tone laced with disbelief. "I am," I replied simply, brushing past him. "This is ridiculous, Clara," he snapped. "You're being petty. You'll regret this." I paused at the door, turning to face him one last time. "Maybe, but at least I won't regret staying in a marriage where I'm nothing more than a joke to you." With that, I stepped outside into the cool night air. As I drove away, the deed to the cabin secure in my bag, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I wasn't just leaving behind my belongings, I was leaving behind the burden of Mark's expectations. I deserved better, and I was finally ready to claim it. I headed straight to my best friend Anna's house in a nearby town. She was the only person I knew who would understand without judgment. When she opened the door, her face fell at the sight of me. "What did he do now?" she asked, her voice full of concern. "Can I come in?" I replied, my tone steady but weary. She stepped aside, gesturing me inside. "Of course. Kitchen or couch?" "Kitchen," I said, knowing she'd already be grabbing a bottle of wine. Minutes later, we were sitting at her small wooden table, a glass of red wine in front of me, her full attention across from me. "All right," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Tell me everything." I took a deep breath and spilled it all. The memory book, Mark's harsh words, his announcement about Sophie, and finally, the cabin deed. By the time I finished, Anna's mouth was hanging open. "He called your gift pointless after everything you've done for him?" she exclaimed, her voice rising with anger. "And then had the nerve to say he's leaving for some young fling? Is he serious?" I nodded, swirling the wine in my glass. "That's Mark, always so sure of himself, always thinking I'd just accept whatever he threw at me, but not this time." Anna's expression softened into a proud smile. "You walked away, Clara. You kept the cabin, and honestly, I'm so glad you did. Good for you." Hearing her say that made something shift inside me. I hadn't just walked away from Mark, I'd walked away from years of trying to mold myself into someone he could value, someone who was never enough in his eyes. "What's next?" Anna asked, pulling me out of my thoughts. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've been so focused on making our marriage work that I'm not even sure who I am without it." She reached across the table, placing a comforting hand over mine. "You'll figure it out one day at a time, but for now, you're staying here tonight. No arguments." I smiled, grateful for her support. "Thanks, Anna." That night, as I lay on her couch, the exhaustion of the day finally caught up with me. But beneath the tiredness, there was something else: relief. Mark was no longer my burden to carry. For years, I'd bent over backward to make him happy, but now I didn't have to. I had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I was excited to find out. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing nonstop on the coffee table. Groaning, I reached for it and squinted at the screen. Missed calls, 8. Text messages, 17. All from Mark. I scrolled through them, each one more desperate than the last. "Where are you? We need to talk." "You're acting like a child, Clara." The irony of that last one made me laugh out loud. He was the one who'd walked away, or so he thought. Anna wandered into the room with a mug of coffee in hand. "Let me guess. Mark?" she said, raising an eyebrow. "Right on the money," I muttered, holding up the phone. "He's freaking out." She set the coffee down in front of me with a smirk. "What did he expect? You don't treat someone like dirt and then act surprised when they stop taking it." I nodded, sipping the warm drink. He's not used to facing consequences. He's always gotten away with his arrogance, his selfishness, but this time he's not getting what he wants. Anna grinned, a satisfied glint in her eye. "Exactly. Let him squirm." Later that day, I got another message from Mark that caught my attention. "I'll come by the house tonight. We need to sort this out." My house. He was still acting like it was his, like he had any right to show up whenever he pleased. I considered replying, telling him to stay away, but Anna's advice from the night before echoed in my mind. Let him stew for a bit. So I ignored the text and spent the day with Anna, running errands and catching up on parts of my life I'd neglected for years. By the time I returned to my house that evening, Mark's car was already parked in the driveway. I pulled up on the street, taking a deep breath before heading to the door. He was pacing in the living room when I walked in, his face a mix of frustration and desperation. "So you finally decided to show up," he said, his tone sharp. "I live here," I replied calmly, setting my bag on the counter. "What are you doing here?" He softened his voice, though it sounded forced. "We need to talk, Clara. This has gotten out of control." I crossed my arms, leaning against the counter. "What's out of control, Mark? The fact that I finally stood up for myself, or the fact that you're realizing Sophie isn't the perfect escape you thought she was?" His jaw clenched, and for a moment I thought he might lash out, but instead he sat down on the couch, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I made a mistake, okay? I wasn't thinking straight, but we can fix this." I let out a bitter laugh. "Fix this? Mark, this isn't a broken lamp. This is years of you taking me for granted, dismissing everything I've done, and expecting me to just smile through it." He started to speak, but I cut him off. "No, you don't get to decide when we fix things. You made your choice. Now live with it." I grabbed my bag and headed upstairs, leaving him sitting there in stunned silence. The next day, I packed his belongings, left them by the front door, and changed the locks. When he showed up that evening, looking as smug as ever, I met him on the porch with a folder in hand and a firm expression on my face. "What's this?" he asked, eyeing the papers. "Your things," I said, pointing to the suitcase by the door. "And this is the contact information for the lawyer I hired this morning. You'll hear from her soon." His jaw tightened, but he couldn't resist one last jab. "You're being absurd, Clara. You can't handle life without me." I gave him a faint smile. "We'll see about that. Now get off my porch." He stared at me, his confidence finally wavering, before grabbing his suitcase and storming off. Over the next couple of weeks, Mark's absence felt like a breath of fresh air. The house was quieter, calmer, and for the first time in years, it felt like a real home instead of a war zone. I kept myself busy, diving into work, reconnecting with old friends, and leaning on Anna for support. She was thrilled to see me taking a stand. "Good riddance," she said when I told her I'd kicked Mark out. "He was holding you back, Clara. You're so much better off without him." I knew she was right, but there were quiet moments, usually late at night, when doubt crept in. Had I made the right choice? What if I ended up regretting this? Those thoughts never lasted long, though, especially not after I got a call from Mark a few weeks later. "Clara, we need to talk," he said, his voice tight with frustration. I sighed, already exhausted by the conversation before it even started. "What do you want, Mark?" There was a pause. Then he spoke, bitterness lacing every word. "It's Sophie. She's gone." A small smile tugged at my lips. "Is that so?" "She laughed at me," he spat out, the words tumbling in a rush. "Said I was pathetic for throwing away the best thing I had. She couldn't believe I let you keep the cabin. Called me an idiot for losing everything you'd built, then just walked out." I couldn't help but grin. Ah, the cabin. I bet that stung. "She said I was a complete loser," he went on, ignoring my sarcasm. "And now you're calling me because—" I prompted, my tone cool. His voice dropped, almost pleading. "Because I made a mistake. A huge one. Can we talk? Please?" I shook my head even though he couldn't see me. "No, Mark. We have nothing to talk about. You made your bed. Now lie in it." Before he could say another word, I hung up, letting the silence wrap around me like a comforting blanket. That night, as I sat on the couch with a cup of tea, I felt a profound sense of relief. Mark's life was falling apart, but for the first time it wasn't my problem. I had my life back, and I wasn't looking back. The divorce process moved quicker than I'd expected. My lawyer helped me sort out my finances, document everything, and ensure I was protected. Sitting in her office, reviewing the final paperwork, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, closure, and a lingering disbelief that this chapter of my life was finally over. "Everything looks solid," my lawyer said, flipping through the pages. Mark doesn't have much ground to stand on, especially since he hasn't fought anything. Honestly, I think he knows he's in no position to challenge you. I nodded, a small smile forming. I think he's finally realized I'm not the doormat he thought I was. She chuckled. I'd say you've made that very clear. As I left her office that afternoon, a weight I hadn't even noticed seemed to lift. The paperwork was filed, my finances were secure, and Mark was officially out of my life, both on paper and in reality. That same evening, Anna came over with a bottle of wine and her signature knack for celebrating my wins. To Clara, she said, raising her glass. The woman who finally sent Mark packing and took back her life. I laughed, clinking my glass against hers. To Anna, the friend who never once said, "I told you so." At least not yet. She smirked, taking a sip. Not yet. As the night went on, we talked about everything, my plans for the future, her latest adventures, and of course Mark's dramatic downfall. Do you think he's still sulking over Sophie? Anna asked, leaning back on the couch with a grin. Probably, I replied, smiling. But with no wife, no house, and no girlfriend, I almost feel bad for him. Almost. Anna burst out laughing. Almost. After she left, I sat alone in the quiet of my home, reflecting on everything that had happened. The old me, the one who constantly sought Mark's approval, who worried endlessly about pleasing him, felt like a distant memory. This new version of myself, the one who could laugh at his failures and find joy in rebuilding my life, was here to stay. Mark had underestimated me, but I hadn't. I was exactly where I was meant to be. The weeks following the divorce were a whirlwind of change, but it was a chaos I controlled. Without Mark's shadow over every decision, I rediscovered parts of myself I'd buried under years of his criticism. It wasn't just about starting over, it was about flourishing. One of the first things I did was visit the lakeside cabin. For so long it had been a symbol of hope, a dream of a better future for us. Now it was mine alone, free from Mark and his disdain. When I pulled up to the property, surrounded by towering evergreens and the serene shimmer of the lake, I felt a surge of pride. I'd made this happen, not for Mark, not for us, but for me. Inside, the cabin was everything I'd pictured, warm and inviting, with wide windows offering breathtaking views. I spent the weekend there by myself, unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and soaking in the peace of knowing I didn't have to share this with someone who didn't appreciate it. Anna visited the following weekend, her energy as infectious as ever. "This place is incredible," she said, spinning in a slow circle in the living room. "How did you keep this a secret for so long?" I laughed, shrugging. I wanted it to be perfect before showing anyone, and honestly, I was worried Mark would ruin it. "Well, it's perfect now," she said, flopping onto the couch, "and you deserve every inch of it." Her words warmed me more than the sunlight streaming through the windows. I felt for the first time in ages that I truly deserved something good. As weeks turned into months, I began filling my life with things I'd put on hold for too long. I picked up photography again, spending hours capturing the beauty of the lake and the surrounding forest. I joined a local book club, something Mark had always mocked as a waste of time, and started traveling. Not for anyone else's sake, but because I wanted to. Each new experience felt like a quiet rebellion against the person I'd been with Mark. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. One evening, as I sat on the cabin's deck with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I thought about the life I'd left behind. There was no anger, no resentment, just gratitude for the lessons I'd learned and the freedom I'd gained. Mark was a distant memory, and I was finally living for myself. A few months after the divorce was finalized, life settled into a new rhythm. The cabin became my sanctuary, a place for quiet reflection or gatherings with friends who shared in the peace I'd found. Anna visited often, always with a bottle of wine and stories of her latest escapades. "You've completely changed, you know that?" she said one evening as we sat by the fire pit, the lake sparkling under the moonlight. I looked at her, curious. "Changed how?" She grinned. "The old Clara would have been fussing over everyone else, checking if the seats were comfy, if the drinks were full. This Clara," she gestured at me, wrapped in a cozy blanket and wearing comfy sweats, is relaxed, happy, and doesn't care what anyone thinks. I laughed, sipping my wine. I guess I've learned I can only control my own happiness. Trying to make Mark happy was like filling a bucket with a hole in it. Nothing was ever enough. That lesson carried beyond the cabin. I started freelancing, something I'd always dreamed of but never pursued because Mark thought it was too risky. Now my schedule was my own, and the freedom was exhilarating. One of my clients, a creative agency, invited me to lead a workshop for their team. The experience reignited a confidence I hadn't felt in years. "Why haven't you started your own business?" the CEO asked afterward. The question lingered long after the meeting ended. Why hadn't I? A few weeks later, I began laying the foundation for my own consulting firm. It was daunting, but for the first time, I wasn't holding myself back out of fear of failure, or worse, Mark's disapproval. Anna cheered me on every step of the way, even helping me name the business. "How about Ember Consulting?" she suggested, her eyes gleaming. "Because you've risen from the flames, stronger than ever." I rolled my eyes but couldn't help smiling. Ember Consulting it is. As I poured myself into building the business, I felt a sense of purpose I'd been missing for years. Every small victory, a new client, a positive review, a completed project, reminded me of how far I'd come. And with every win, there was a quiet moment of gratitude for the strength I'd found, the friends who'd stood by me, and the chance to rebuild my life on my terms. One evening, as I sat on the deck with my laptop, finalizing plans for a new project, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Mark. "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen for a moment before deleting it without a reply. Some things were better left in the past. 6 months after walking away from Mark, I stood on the deck of the cabin, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The lake shimmered with hues of amber and rose, a view that once felt like a distant dream, but now felt like a promise I'd made to myself and kept. Ember Consulting was thriving beyond my wildest expectations. The freedom to choose my clients, my hours, and my projects made me feel alive in ways I hadn't in years. Anna visited that evening, as she often did, carrying a box of pastries from a local bakery. "You know, I never thought I'd say this," she said, setting the box on the table, "but I think Mark did you a favor." I laughed, pouring us each a glass of wine. "You're not wrong. If he hadn't been such a jerk, I might still be stuck trying to please him." She raised her glass. "To Mark, the world's most clueless man, for setting you free." We clinked glasses, laughing, but her words stayed with me long after she left. I'd been so focused on moving forward that I hadn't paused to reflect on just how much had changed. The timid version of myself, always seeking Mark's approval, felt like a stranger. This new life wasn't just about escaping a toxic marriage. It was about rediscovering who I was, what I wanted, and what brought me joy. And I finally knew the answers. As the stars began to pepper the sky, I grabbed a notebook and pen, jotting down ideas for the future. A new strategy for Ember Consulting, a list of destinations I wanted to explore, goals I hadn't dared to dream of until now. Closing the notebook and gazing out at the lake, I realized something profound. I wasn't just free from Mark's expectations, I was free from my own doubts, the ones that had kept me small and scared for so long. A month later, I received an email from a client with the subject line "Speaking Opportunity." Curious, I opened it and read the message. They wanted me to deliver a keynote speech at an upcoming industry conference about my journey as an entrepreneur and the success of Ember Consulting. For a moment, I hesitated. Public speaking had never been my strength. Mark used to mock me for stumbling over words in casual chats, let alone a formal presentation, but his voice no longer held power over me. I hit reply and typed, "I'd be honored to participate." Preparing for the keynote became my new focus. With Anna's encouragement, I poured my energy into crafting a speech that felt genuine. "Don't hold back," she advised. "Tell your story as it is. Struggles, victories, everything. That's what resonates." And that's exactly what I did. On the day of the conference, as I stood backstage waiting for my turn, a mix of nerves and excitement bubbled inside me. When the host introduced me, I stepped onto the stage to polite applause, took a deep breath, and began. "My name is Clara, And just a year ago, I never imagined I'd be standing here. Back then, my life revolved around meeting the expectations of someone who didn't believe in me. But today, I'm here because I chose to believe in myself. As I spoke, sharing the story of how Ember Consulting emerged from a place of rediscovery, I noticed the audience leaning in, nodding, and taking notes. My voice mattered, not just to me, but to them. After the speech, several attendees approached me, sharing their own stories of struggle and renewal. "You inspired me today," one woman said, her eyes shining with emotion. "Thank you for reminding me it's never too late to start over." Her words lingered as I left the conference, feeling more empowered than ever. That evening, sitting on the cabin's deck, I reflected on everything that had brought me here: the heartbreak, the betrayal, the doubts. It had all been part of the journey. Mark was a faded memory, his messages long ignored. Sophie had been right about him, but I didn't need validation from her, him, or anyone else. I had built a life I loved, one step at a time, and this was only the beginning. This was my story now, and I was writing every single word.